Well, welcome, Karen. Welcome to Canadians with Disabilities and Their Allies for another awesome segment. And Karen's going to be speaking about a lot of great topics regarding neurodiversity and autism. And you got the mic there, Karen.
So yeah, my name is Karen, as you said. I also go by neurodiversity in principle on Twitter. It's not that long ago since I actually quote unquote unmasked, and not in the context of the pandemic, but rather in the context of, I used to have two different Twitter handles, and the neurodiversity in principle was the one that I would tweet more authentically from. And then I had my, other one, which I don't use anymore, which was my name. And just, working in education for so many years, and being a later diagnosed individual, about, I want to say it's just over 5 years. There's been so many layers to peel back and understand. And I think that many of us continue to do that on a daily basis, where we're trying to figure out, what is being masked and what is being unmasked. And I mean, I can share a little bit about what that means, because I know for context, there's going to be people listening live or in a recording later on. And I want to make sure that the terminology that I'm using is something that is accessible for everybody that's listening. And so for me, the first aspect that I want to share in terms of the language that I use, and I'll stress that, there are a variety of ways that people may identify, and that's completely fine. But for me, I use what's called identity first language. There is a growing population of folks around the world that are using identity first language. So that's when I would say I'm autistic. I don't say that I have autism. I used to interchangeably say that I was on the spectrum. I don't use that language anymore. And prior to that, and I'll get into the reasons for that, and prior to that, like many of us who are late diagnosed, there was another diagnosis called Asperger's, that some people may be familiar with that terminology, and that name is no longer in the diagnostic criteria, at least where I am. But, people are diagnosed with that, and that diagnosis still exists. It still lives in their files so that it allows them to get services or whatever it is. But new diagnostic practice now, where that word has been phased out, it's there's still a version thereof, right? You're just considered autistic. So everybody is autistic, but we don't use the same criteria that we used to. So I won't get into the particulars of that. It's based on what's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and that was updated a number of years ago to change some of the criteria. But again, this isn't about the diagnostic process, because within the neurodiversity movement, the neurodiversity paradigm, where we really want to shift the language from the medical model of disability, which is based on a deficit lens, it's based on criteria, it's based on like a list of quote unquote symptoms that then result in a quote unquote diagnosis. And it doesn't mean that there's not accuracy or connections to diagnostic criteria. It's just that to have an autistic neurology is not just like anything that's in there, right? That's a social construct. It's a list that was created. There's many layers to the history of autism, and I can certainly reference a number of different sources that I would recommend if people were wanting to dig deeper into that. Autistic Collaboration Trust does a lot of excellent work on that. Kieran Rose has done some tremendous work outlining that in his trainings. So we won't get into too much of that right now, because I really would rather focus more on moving from the medical model of disability, which is an understanding of, the typical process that a family goes through. There's a child, the child is maybe experiencing some challenges at school or even before school, and because of what they're quote unquote not able to do, or what shows up as challenges for them, and again I say challenges but that's in the context of what's seen as successful, what's seen as quote-unquote normal, what's seen as quote-unquote typical in a school setting, keeping in mind that our schools are not necessarily built around non-neurotypical students, right? So we can't blame the schools for that. We can't blame individual educators for that or individual leaders for that. But we do have a real problem when we have a lot of different movements, a lot of different voices that are coming to the table to try and figure out how do we best support our children, how do we best support our young adults or our late diagnosed adults who are autistic. And when I mentioned, identity first language earlier on, I want to stress that it used to be that if you were an educator or a doctor or a parent, guardian, a therapist, what have you, whatever practitioner, the language that was supposed to be used, that they would urge you to use, that they would say, if you're going to publish something, make sure you use what they call person first language. That would be where you say, so-and-so has autism, they're a person with autism. And the reasoning behind that was because they would say, well, you need to put the person first. And so a lot of people might be nodding their heads as they're listening. Oh, yeah, that's what I was taught. And most of my staff, that's what they were taught. Most educators that I know, that's what they were taught. And indeed, that is still what's being taught in many places. The thing is, to say somebody is with autism or that they have autism, what that's doing is that's accepting the medical model of disability, which is based on, like I said, that criteria, that list. And it is basically saying that if somebody doesn't say that I'm a person first, then am I not human? Like it's kind of ludicrous, right? Like I think that I'm a human being. So to say you're a person first, the thing is, if they'll say like, put yourself first, it's a person first, and you're more than your autism is what they'll say, right? So they'll say, well, don't say autistic. But for me and for many of us in the autistic community, the brain is it controls everything. So if my neurology is based on an autistic neurology, if my brain is an autistic brain, then I can't remove that. And to remove that would cease to, have me be me. So it really doesn't make sense in that school of thought to say, like, I'm a person with autism. And there's a great graphic out there, which I'm sure many people have seen, and it's got 4 pictures, right? I think it's called identityfirst.org or something like that. And it's like, a person with autism is like they're sitting beside on the couch with autism, or they're holding a briefcase with autism, right? So that's you're carrying it around with you. I don't carry around anything called autism. And then there's one that's like suffers from. So it's actually like a rainbow dagger, and it's you suffer from, and you still hear people say somebody suffers from autism. It's really, if we think about it and we move towards this model called the social model of disability, which I can certainly get into a little bit, it's really not the neurology that's causing a lot of the suffering. What's causing any suffering in many cases when somebody is autistic, and again, I can only speak to my own experiences, but I also am connected with people all around the world with varying lived experiences as autistic individuals, speaking, non-speaking, intersectional lenses, you name it, right? And we are impacted most by the inaccessibility, by the defaults in society, by all of the things that basically other us. And I remember sharing with a group of young adults, if you picture the world's population as kind of like an orange with a segment of it, right? That one segment might represent the autistic neurologies in the world, in the global population. And so who holds the power, right? Who's going to, if you think of that sheer volume of people represented by that orange that's got only one segment out of it, that volume is going to be what dictates what is happening in schools, in systems, in publications, in research, in measures of success, right, in capitalistic society, in all of the different ways that the majority population usually holds the most power. But the minority population, and in this case I'm referring to autistics, is represented by that segment. And if you are somebody who's in that segment, you are deemed to be, quote unquote, not normal, because the standards that you're judged by, the diagnostic criteria, the, you know, how you're supposed to interact, how you're supposed to move, how you're supposed to, you know, like quote unquote social skills, all of those things are based on the orange's version of reality, those ways of being and experience the world. And what's interesting is there's a gentleman by the name of Damien Milton who's done some tremendous work on what's called the double empathy problem. And what was discovered, and again, there's like a lot of writing about that, and you can certainly follow Damien Milton on Twitter as well. But the research shows that autistics, even though we're considered to have a communication deficit based on the diagnostic criteria, autistics actually communicate just as well, and actually even more, even better with other autistics compared to allistics or non-autistics, and their efficacy and effectiveness communicating with other non-autistics, which is interesting. So if that's the case, and yes, I'm not saying that autistics communicate perfectly, but we communicate differently from the neurotypical majority, from the non-autistic majority. And so we're the ones that are perceived to have communication deficits, right? So again, power and privilege. And I think, you know, somebody might say, oh, well, you could say that, Karen, but, you know, here you are talking, you're blabbing on and blabbing on. But what people don't realize is that I may be able to blab on right now, depending on sensory situation, depending on stress levels, depending on circumstances, but I'm actually situationally mute, as many of us, you know, have hyper and hyposensitivity of sensory experiences, and we have, you know, a whole variety of differences neurologically that can impact what type of communication we can use at any given moment. And so that's really challenging for some people. Like, a lot of people heard the word autism, but it's not about, you know, awareness that autism exists. The move, as many of us in the community know, is about acceptance. And I like to say it's not just about acceptance, but it's also about advocacy and also that challenging the role of active allies. There's too many people that will go around and say, well, I'm an ally, but an ally really has to be active. They have to be digging deeper into their own biases. They have to be challenging the status quo. They have to be constantly questioning their own biases. And, you know, so it's one thing for people to do a little bit of reading or participate in a workshop, but if that doesn't impact their action, and if they don't continually put that at the forefront and think of, you know, their moral imperative to change what they're doing, their practice, to learn more from autistics in this case, then really they're not actually being allies, right? So I mean, I think that's why acceptance is important, but acceptance is a big word in the autistic community.